There is a moment in every human life when the soul begins to stir, not with the violent thrashing of awakening from nightmare, but with the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of something ancient, recognizing that it has grown beyond the boundaries of its current form. This is the first crack in the chrysalis, the hairline fracture in the shell of who you thought you were, through which the light of who you might become begins to seep. It happens in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in that suspended moment when the familiar suddenly feels foreign. Perhaps you're sitting in your childhood bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of a former self, and you feel like an archaeological visitor, examining the remnants of a civilization you once inhabited, but can no longer call home. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just the way the morning coffee tastes different, as if your very palate has evolved beyond its former preferences, leaving you holding a cup that belongs to someone you used to be. The psyche does not announce its transformations with fanfare. There are no trumpets heralding the death of the old self, no ceremonial drums marking the birth of the new. Instead, there is only this quiet rebellion, a whispered no to the patterns that once felt as natural as breathing, a gentle but insistent questioning of the truths that once seemed absolute. It is the soul's first tentative step away from the collective dream, the inherited script, the ancestral blueprint that mapped out a life you no longer wish to live. This stirring is both gift and burden, for it marks the beginning of what Jung called the process of individuation, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness that demands nothing less than the courage to become who you authentically are. But here, in these earliest moments, you cannot yet see the scope of what lies ahead. You only know that something fundamental has shifted, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the surface of consciousness, rearranging the very foundation upon which your sense of self has rested. The rebellion begins small. Perhaps it's the way you find yourself lingering in conversations that once would have bored you, drawn to ideas that your former self would have dismissed. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you discover that the things that once animated you now feel hollow, like echoes in an empty cathedral. The books that once spoke to your soul now seem to belong to a stranger. The activities that once brought joy feel like performances you're no longer willing to give. The relationships that once felt essential begin to reveal themselves as costumes you've outgrown. This is the paradox of growth. It often feels like loss. As the soul expands, the container of the familiar becomes too small, and what was once sanctuary becomes prison. The very structures that once supported your being, your beliefs, your relationships, your sense of purpose, begin to feel like constraints, well-meaning but suffocating attempts to keep you in a shape that no longer fits the growing essence within. Jung understood this process intimately. He knew that the ego, that carefully constructed sense of self that navigates the world, must eventually yield to something larger, something more authentic. He called this larger something the self, the archetype of wholeness that contains both who we have been and who we are becoming. But the journey from ego to self is not a gentle transition. It is a death and a birth, a dissolution and a reconstitution, a sacred dismemberment that precedes every true transformation. In these early stirrings, you are like the mythical serpent, sensing that its skin has become too tight. There is an inexplicable restlessness, an itch that cannot be scratched, a knowing that cannot be unknowed. The old skin must be shed, but not yet. First comes this period of growing discomfort, this increasing awareness that the familiar has become foreign, that the comfortable has become constrictive. The people closest to you may sense this shift before you fully understand it yourself. They see something in your eyes, a distance, a questioning, a quality of attention that wasn't there before. You're present, but somehow not present, engaged, but also observing your own engagement with the newly awakened witness consciousness. It's as if part of you has stepped outside the story of your life and is watching it unfold with curious detachment. This observer self, this witness consciousness, is both the agent and the first fruit of transformation. It is the part of you that can see the patterns you've been living, the roles you've been playing, the unconscious scripts that have been directing your life's drama. And with this seeing comes the first taste of freedom, the recognition that what you have been is not necessarily what you must continue to be. But freedom is terrifying, especially to those parts of you that have found safety in the familiar. The ego, with its desperate need for continuity and control, begins to sound alarms. It whispers of the dangers of change, the risks of growth, the security of staying small. It reminds you of all the ways that transformation has gone wrong for others, all the stories of those who ventured too far from the known and lost themselves in the wilderness of becoming. These voices of resistance are not enemies to be conquered, but aspects of self to be understood. They arise from the deepest biological imperative, survival. The ego equates the known with safety, and safety with survival. To venture into the unknown, to allow the familiar structures of self to dissolve, feels like death. And in a very real sense, it is. Something must die for something new to be born. And the ego senses this approaching dissolution, with all the terror of an organism facing its own extinction. Yet something deeper than the ego is calling. Jung called it the self, but it might just as well be called the soul, the spirit, the essential essence that exists beyond all the roles and identities and personas we wear. This deeper something knows that what feels like death is actually birth, that what appears as dissolution is actually integration, that what seems like loss is actually the shedding of illusion to reveal what was always true. The first crack in the chrysalis is often precipitated by what appears to be crisis, but is actually initiation. A relationship ends, a career falters, a belief system crumbles, a dream dies. The structures that once provided meaning and identity suddenly seem inadequate, and you find yourself standing in the ruins of your former certainties, wondering who you are without the familiar landmarks of self-definition. This is the moment of what the ancients called the dark night of the soul, not yet the deeper descents that may come later, but the first taste of that sacred darkness in which all transformation begins. It is the darkness of the seed in the soil, the darkness of the unborn in the womb, the darkness of the chrysalis in which the caterpillar dissolves into cellular soup before reconstituting as butterfly. In this darkness, the old self begins its slow dissolution. The beliefs that once seemed so solid start to feel transparent. The relationships that once felt so essential reveal their limitations. The dreams that once pulled you forward lose their magnetic power. You are caught between worlds, no longer who you were, not yet who you are becoming, suspended in the liminal space where all real transformation occurs. This suspension is perhaps the most difficult part of the early stages of growth. There is no map for this territory, no guidebook for becoming. The old rules no longer apply, but the new ones have not yet revealed themselves. You are walking by faith rather than sight, following an inner compass whose true north points not toward any external destination, but toward the authentic self that has been waiting perhaps for decades to be born. The mythic traditions understand this process well. Every hero's journey begins with a call to adventure that requires leaving the familiar world behind. Every spiritual tradition speaks of the necessary death of the false self. Every depth psychology acknowledges that consciousness cannot expand without first encountering the dissolution of its current boundaries. You are living this ancient story now, though you may not yet recognize yourself as the hero of your own transformation. You are responding to a call that comes not from the external world, but from the depths of your own being. You are being invited to outgrow the skin of who you thought you were and step into the larger garment of who you truly are. This invitation does not come with guarantees. There is no promise that the journey will be easy, that the path will be clear, that the people in your life will understand or approve of your transformation. In fact, as you will discover, growth often appears to others as a form of betrayal, a violation of the unspoken contract to remain who they need you to be rather than becoming who you are called to be. But something within you is stronger than the fear, deeper than the doubt, more persistent than the resistance. Call it the evolutionary impulse of the soul, the divine discontent that refuses to settle for less than authentic being. It is this force that creates the first crack in the chrysalis, that begins the sacred process of psychological metamorphosis, that will reshape not only your inner landscape, but the very quality of your presence in the world. You may not yet understand what is happening to you. You may feel confused, lost, even frightened by these stirrings. But trust the process, trust the crack in the chrysalis, for it is not a sign that something is wrong. It is evidence that something is finally, beautifully, courageously going right. Your soul is awakening. Your authentic self is stirring. Your true nature is preparing to emerge from the cocoon of conditioned being into the light of conscious becoming. The first crack has appeared. The transformation has begun, and nothing will ever be quite the same again. As you begin to shed the familiar skin of your former self, something unexpected and often painful begins to happen in your relationships, without intending it, without even being aware of it at first. You become a mirror, a polished surface that reflects back to others the very things they have spent years, perhaps decades, carefully avoiding about themselves. Your growing consciousness creates a kind of involuntary alchemy, separating the authentic from the performative, the genuine from the manufactured, the conscious from the unconscious in everyone around you. This is not something you choose to do. You do not wake up one morning and decide to become a catalyst for other people's self-examination. Rather, it is the natural and inevitable consequence of inner work. When you begin to see through your own illusions, you inadvertently develop the ability to see through the illusions of others. When you start to question your own patterns, you cannot help but notice the patterns that govern those around you. When you begin to live more authentically, your very presence becomes a challenge to inauthenticity wherever it exists. The psychological principle at work here is as old as consciousness itself. Jung called it projection, the unconscious act of seeing in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. But what happens when someone begins to withdraw their projections, when they start to own their shadow, when they cease to participate in the collective agreement to remain unconscious? They become what the alchemists might have called a philosopher's stone, a catalyst that precipitates transformation in everything it touches. At first, this mirroring function may be subtle. Perhaps you find yourself in conversations where your simple presence seems to make others uncomfortable, though you cannot pinpoint why. You're not saying anything particularly challenging, not behaving differently than you always have, yet there's a quality in the air, a tension, an awkwardness, a sense that something unspoken is happening beneath the surface of ordinary interaction. What you're witnessing is the collision between consciousness and unconsciousness, between authenticity and persona, between growth and stagnation. Your expanding awareness creates a kind of energetic field that makes pretense difficult to maintain. The masks that others wear begin to feel heavy in your presence. The roles they've been playing start to feel like costumes that no longer fit. The stories they tell themselves about who they are begin to sound hollow, even to their own ears. This is the mirror's uncomfortable truth. Personal growth is contagious, but so is the resistance to it. When you begin to live more consciously, you unconsciously invite others to examine their own level of consciousness. When you start to question the inherited beliefs and patterns that have shaped your life, your very questioning becomes an implicit challenge to those who have never questioned their own inheritance. When you begin to choose authenticity over approval, you highlight the places where others have chosen approval over authenticity. The mirroring process works both ways, of course. Just as your presence reveals others' unconscious patterns to them, their reactions to your growth reveal aspects of yourself that you might not otherwise see. The people who become most uncomfortable with your evolution often point to the places where you yourself are still attached to old ways of being. Their resistance can serve as a kind of spiritual feedback system, showing you where your own growth edges lie. But in these early stages of transformation, it is often the reactions of others that feel most pronounced and puzzling. You may find that people who once seemed to enjoy your company now act strangely around you. They may become defensive for no apparent reason, or critical in ways they never were before. They may seem to be arguing with something you haven't said, responding to some implicit challenge you didn't know you were issuing. This is because the mirror you've become is reflecting back to them their own unlived potential, their own avoided growth, their own resistance to change. Your willingness to question and evolve becomes a reminder of their unwillingness to do the same. Your courage to face your shadow highlights their ongoing investment in keeping their own shadow safely hidden. Your movement toward authenticity illuminates the ways in which they remain trapped in performance and pretense. The psychological mechanism at work here is what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for things to transform into their opposites when carried to an extreme. The very people who might once have celebrated your growth may now find themselves opposing it, not out of malice, but out of the deep discomfort that arises when someone close to them begins to outgrow the familiar dynamics that have defined their relationship. Consider how this might manifest in your daily life. The family member who always relied on you to play a certain role, the caretaker, the responsible one, the problem solver, suddenly finds that you're no longer willing to inhabit that role with the same unconscious automaticity. You haven't announced this change. It's simply that your growing self-awareness has made it impossible to continue playing parts that no longer align with your authentic being. But to them, this shift feels like abandonment, like betrayal, like a violation of the unspoken contract that has governed your relationship. They may accuse you of selfishness, of thinking you're better than them, of becoming someone they don't recognize. What they're really responding to is the discomfort of seeing their own unconscious patterns reflected in the mirror of your consciousness. Or perhaps it's a friend who has always bonded with you over shared complaints, mutual cynicism, or collective victimhood. As you begin to take responsibility for your own life, as you start to see opportunities where you once saw only obstacles, as you choose empowerment over blame, the familiar ground of your friendship begins to shift. Your friend may interpret your growing optimism as judgment of their pessimism, your increasing responsibility as criticism of their tendency to blame external circumstances. The mirror reflects not just what is, but what could be. And for those who are invested in believing that change is impossible, that growth is naive, that people cannot really evolve, your living example becomes an uncomfortable contradiction to their fundamental worldview. You become evidence of possibilities they have told themselves don't exist, living proof of transformations they have convinced themselves are beyond reach. This mirroring function extends beyond individual relationships into groups and communities. When one member of a family system, a workplace, or a social circle begins to evolve, The entire system feels the disturbance. Psychological homeostasis, the unconscious agreement to keep things as they are, is threatened by the presence of someone who is actively choosing to become more than they were. The group may unconsciously mobilize to bring the evolving individual back into line, to restore the familiar equilibrium, to preserve the collective agreement, to remain unconscious. This can take many forms: emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, social ostracism, or simply the withdrawal of the approval and acceptance that the individual once enjoyed. The message, though rarely spoken directly, is clear: conform or be excluded. But the mirror's reflection cannot be stopped simply by looking away. Once you have begun the process of conscious evolution, you carry within you a quality of presence that continues to reflect truth back to others, whether you intend to or not. Your very being becomes a catalyst for awakening, even, or perhaps especially, for those who are most resistant to being awakened. This is why the path of individuation is often a lonely one, at least in its initial stages. The mirror you have become reveals not only the unconsciousness of others, but the degree to which your former relationships were based on shared unconsciousness, mutual projection, and collective agreement to remain asleep to deeper truths. As you withdraw from these unconscious agreements, as you cease to participate in the familiar patterns of projection and denial, you may find yourself increasingly isolated from the very people who once felt closest to you. The pain of this isolation is real and should not be minimized. To discover that relationships you thought were deep were actually built on shallow foundations, to realize that connections you believed were authentic were actually based on mutual self-deception, to understand that love you experienced was often conditional on your willingness to remain small. These recognitions can shake you to your core, yet this uncomfortable mirroring serves a sacred purpose in your own evolution. Every relationship that cannot survive your growth teaches you something essential about the nature of authentic connection. Every person who rejects your evolving self helps clarify what kind of relationships you actually want to cultivate going forward. Every mirror that reflects back discomfort or resistance also reflects back the progress you have made on your own journey of becoming. The mirror's truth is uncomfortable precisely because it is true. The reflections that others find most disturbing are often the most accurate, the most necessary, the most potentially transformative. Your growing consciousness serves not as judgment, but as invitation, an offering to others of the same freedom and authenticity that you are claiming for yourself. Whether they accept that invitation is not your responsibility. Your task is simply to continue your own evolution, to keep polishing the mirror of your consciousness, to remain committed to your own process of becoming regardless of how others react to the reflections you provide. The mirror does not apologize for showing what is. It simply reflects clearly and without distortion whatever is placed before it. In time, you may discover that the very quality that makes some people uncomfortable, your growing authenticity, your increasing consciousness, your willingness to face truth, is exactly what draws others to you. The mirror that repels those invested in illusion attracts those hungry for reality. The light that blinds those committed to darkness becomes a beacon for those seeking their own path to illumination. But that is still to come. For now, in these early stages of your transformation, the mirror's uncomfortable truth serves primarily as confirmation that your evolution is real, that your growth is genuine, that the changes you feel within are manifesting in the world around you. The disturbance you create in others is evidence of the disturbance you have allowed in yourself, the sacred disruption of unconscious patterns that must precede any authentic transformation. There exists in every human collective an unspoken agreement, a psychological contract written in invisible ink, and signed by unconscious consent. We will remain asleep together. We will not ask the questions that might shatter our shared illusions. We will not challenge the beliefs that keep our world feeling stable and predictable. We will not shine light into the corners where our collective shadows dwell. This agreement forms the very foundation of what we call normalcy, the bedrock of social cohesion, the sacred covenant that allows groups to function without the constant upheaval of truth-telling and authentic examination. But when one member of the tribe begins to awaken, when someone starts asking the forbidden questions, challenging the unquestioned assumptions, seeing through the agreed-upon illusions, the entire structure of collective unconsciousness is threatened. Your evolution becomes an act of involuntary rebellion against the psychological status quo, a disruption in the field of shared sleep that sends ripples of discomfort throughout the entire system. This is perhaps one of the most isolating aspects of personal growth, discovering that your awakening is experienced by others, not as a gift to be celebrated, but as a threat to be neutralized. The very consciousness you have fought so hard to cultivate, the awareness you have paid such a price to develop, the authenticity you have struggled to embody, all of this becomes a source of disturbance in the carefully maintained equilibrium of unconscious collective life. The psychological ecosystem of any group depends on a delicate balance of shared projections, mutual enabling of unconscious patterns, and collective agreement to avoid certain territories of truth. When everyone participates in this system, it functions smoothly like a well-rehearsed dance, where every participant knows their steps, and no one breaks character. But your growing consciousness makes you an increasingly unreliable partner in this unconscious choreography, where others expect you to nod in agreement with familiar complaints. You offer new perspectives, where the group traditionally bonds over shared judgments of outsiders. You question the need to define yourselves in opposition to others, where the collective finds comfort in familiar patterns of blame and victimhood. You suggest the possibility of personal responsibility and empowerment. Your very presence becomes a disruption in the smooth operation of unconscious group dynamics. This disruption is not something you plan or intend. It arises naturally from the simple act of becoming more conscious. When you begin to see through your own psychological defenses, you cannot help but recognize similar defenses in others. When you start to take responsibility for your own projections, you become less available to participate in collective projection. When you cease to find your identity through opposition to external enemies, you can no longer join in the tribal solidarity that comes from shared animosity. The questions you now ask, perhaps innocently, perhaps desperately seeking genuine connection, pierce through the comfortable fog that has allowed the group to avoid deeper examination. Why do we always talk about problems but never about solutions? You might wonder aloud, what if this situation we're complaining about is actually an opportunity for growth? Have we considered that our perspective might be only one side of a larger truth? These questions, innocent as they may seem, land in the group consciousness like stones thrown into still water. They create ripples that disturb the surface calm, revealing depth that the collective has agreed to ignore. Your curiosity becomes dangerous because it threatens to expose the very foundations upon which the group's sense of reality rests. The threat you represent is existential in nature. If you can change, if you can grow, if you can evolve beyond the familiar patterns that have defined you, then change is possible for everyone. This possibility is simultaneously the greatest gift you could offer, and the most terrifying prospect the group could face. For if change is possible, then the current state of things cannot be blamed on unchangeable circumstances, inherited limitations, or external forces beyond anyone's control. Your transformation implies that others too might be responsible for their own evolution. Your growing consciousness suggests that others too might be capable of waking up from the collective dream. Your authentic self-expression hints that others too might be living lives that are less than fully authentic. These implications penetrate the group consciousness, like unwelcome light streaming into a room where everyone has agreed to keep the curtains drawn. The collective response to this threat follows predictable patterns, as ancient as human social organization itself. First comes subtle pressure to conform, jokes about your new ideas, gentle teasing about your phase, friendly reminders of how you used to be. The group attempts to restore equilibrium through social pressure, hoping that your need for acceptance will override your commitment to growth. When subtle pressure fails, the stakes escalate. The group may begin to pathologize your changes, interpreting your evolution as evidence of instability, selfishness, or delusion. Your growing boundaries become being difficult. Your increasing authenticity becomes thinking you're better than everyone else. Your unwillingness to participate in familiar dynamics becomes not caring about the relationship. The very qualities that represent psychological health and maturation are reframed as character flaws or personality disorders. This reframing serves multiple functions for the collective unconscious. It discredits your example, making your transformation appear as something to be avoided rather than emulated. It provides a shared focus for the group's discomfort, channeling their anxiety about change into criticism of your choices. Most importantly, it allows the group to maintain their existing patterns while casting you as the problem that needs to be solved. The mythology of the group begins to shift to accommodate your evolving role. Stories emerge about how you've changed, and not for the better. Your former self is romanticized, idealized, held up as evidence of who you really are. Beneath this troubling new persona, the person you're becoming is treated as an imposter, a false self that has somehow displaced the real you that the group knew and loved. This mythologizing process reveals something profound about the nature of collective identity. Groups form their sense of cohesion, not just around shared values or common interests, but around shared limitations, mutual wounds, and collective agreements about what is and isn't possible. When you transcend these shared limitations, when you heal wounds that the group has accepted as permanent, when you demonstrate possibilities that the group has agreed don't exist, you threaten the very foundation of their collective identity. The group's resistance to your evolution is not personal, though it certainly feels personal. It is systemic, arising from the deep biological and psychological imperative to maintain the stability of the social organism. From the perspective of the collective unconscious, your growth represents a kind of genetic mutation, a deviation from the established pattern that might either enhance the group's evolution or threaten its survival. Unfortunately, groups in the grip of collective unconsciousness typically interpret all change as threat rather than opportunity. The unknown appears dangerous rather than promising. Evolution feels like dissolution rather than expansion. Your individuation process is experienced as betrayal of the collective rather than a gift to it. This dynamic plays out across all levels of human organization, from families to nations. The family member who breaks the cycle of inherited dysfunction threatens the family's story about why things are the way they are. The employee who suggests new approaches challenges the organization's investment in established procedures. The citizen who questions prevailing narratives disrupts the social agreements that maintain political stability. In each case, the awakening individual faces a profound choice: remain loyal to the collective sleep or commit to their own awakening. This choice cannot be avoided, delayed, or negotiated. The two states of consciousness, collective unconsciousness and individual awakening, become increasingly incompatible as your evolution deepens. The pain of this incompatibility cannot be understated. To discover that your growth is experienced as betrayal by those you love, to realize that your consciousness is perceived as judgment by those closest to you, to understand that your authenticity threatens the very relationships you hoped it would enhance. These recognitions can shake your commitment to the path of individuation. Yet, there is something inexorable about conscious evolution once it has begun. The genie cannot be returned to the bottle. The egg cannot be unscrambled. The chrysalis cannot return to being a caterpillar. Having tasted the freedom of authentic being, having glimpsed the possibilities that exist beyond inherited limitations, having experienced the aliveness that comes from conscious choice, you find it impossible to voluntarily return to the unconscious agreements that once felt like home. The threat you pose to collective sleep becomes, paradoxically, your initiation into a larger awakening. In being rejected by the unconscious collective, you are forced to develop a relationship with consciousness itself. In being expelled from the familiar tribe, you begin your search for others who share your commitment to growth. In being seen as dangerous by those invested in remaining unconscious, you discover the courage to become who you truly are. The questions that once disturbed the collective peace become your companions on the journey of awakening. The perspectives that once threatened group harmony become the foundation of your individual authenticity. The consciousness that once disrupted familiar patterns becomes the source of your deepest fulfillment and your greatest gift to a world desperately in need of awakening. The threat to collective sleep is not a bug in the system of human consciousness. It is a feature. It is how evolution proceeds, how consciousness expands, how the species grows beyond its current limitations. Your awakening threatens the collective dream, precisely because it points toward a greater dreaming, a more conscious way of being together, a more authentic form of human community. For now, you are the disturber of the peace, the questioner of certainties, the threat to collective sleep. But in time, if you remain true to your path of awakening, you may discover that what appeared to be destruction was actually creation, what seemed like ending was actually beginning, and what felt like exile was actually the first step toward finding your true tribe. Those rare souls who share your commitment to consciousness, your hunger for authenticity, and your courage to remain awake in a world that prefers to dream. There comes a moment in every transformative journey when you realize that the relationships which once felt like perfect fits now feel like garments you've outgrown, still recognizable, still carrying the warmth of memory, but no longer able to contain the expanding dimensions of who you're becoming. This is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking recognitions of personal evolution, that love alone is not always enough to bridge the gap between different levels of consciousness, different stages of growth, different commitments to awakening. Like a tree whose root system has spread far beyond the boundaries of its original container, your evolving consciousness begins to press against the limits of relationships that were formed when you were smaller, less aware, operating from a more contracted sense of self. The container that once provided perfect support and nourishment now feels constrictive, unable to accommodate the new growth, the deeper roots, the broader canopy of your expanding being. This outgrowing happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. You might notice it in the quality of conversations that once satisfied you but now feel hollow, like echoing in an empty chamber. The topics that used to animate hours of discussion now seem to skim along the surface of what you really want to explore. The depth you hunger for feels perpetually just out of reach, as if you're speaking different languages even when using the same words. Perhaps it's the way certain friends seem to relate only to who you used to be, constantly referencing old stories, old dynamics, old versions of yourself. that feel like costumes you've outgrown. They speak to you as if you're still the same person who shared their particular struggles, their specific worldview, their familiar patterns of thinking and being, but something fundamental has shifted in you, and their continued relating to your former self feels like a gentle but persistent denial of your evolution. Or maybe it's the activities that once brought joy and connection, now feeling meaningless, like going through the motions of a dance you no longer want to perform. The social gatherings that used to energize you now drain you. The entertainment that used to capture your attention now seems trivial. The pursuits that used to provide meaning now feel like elaborate forms of distraction from what you've come to recognize as more essential concerns. This is not a judgment of others or their choices. This is simply the natural consequence of consciousness expanding beyond its former boundaries. When your inner landscape transforms, your outer requirements inevitably shift as well. The psychological ecosystem that once supported your former self may no longer be capable of nourishing who you're becoming. Jung understood this process intimately through his own experience of outgrowing the containers of his professional and personal relationships. He knew that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, often requires the courage to disappoint those who prefer you to remain who you were. The authentic self cannot be constrained by the expectations, needs, and comfort zones of others, no matter how well-intentioned or loving those others might be. The pain of this recognition runs deep because it challenges one of our most fundamental beliefs about love and relationship, that they should be able to accommodate any change, weather any transformation, adapt to any evolution. We want to believe that true connection transcends the specifics of personality, worldview, and consciousness level. We hope that authentic love will find a way to bridge any gap, overcome any difference, adapt to any growth. But consciousness is not infinitely flexible in its compatibility. Different levels of awareness create different languages, different priorities, different ways of being in the world. The person committed to psychological growth may find it increasingly difficult to relate to those invested in remaining unconscious. The individual exploring spiritual dimensions may feel alienated from those who insist that only material reality matters. The soul awakening to its authentic nature may struggle to connect with those still identified entirely with their personas. This is the cruel paradox of growth. The very development that makes you more yourself may make you less compatible with the relationships that helped shape that self. The consciousness that brings you closer to your true nature may create distance from the people who knew you in your unconscious state. The authenticity that feels like coming home to yourself may feel like abandonment to those who loved your former performance. The container metaphor reveals something essential about the nature of relationship. Every connection exists within certain parameters, spoken and unspoken agreements about who each person will be, what roles they will play, what behaviors are acceptable, what growth is permitted. These parameters form the invisible walls of the relational container, creating a space that feels safe and predictable for all involved. But when one person begins to expand beyond these agreed-upon boundaries, the container becomes too small. The relationship that once felt spacious now feels cramped. The dynamic that once felt natural now feels forced. The connection that once flowed effortlessly now requires constant effort to maintain. The container has become a cage, and the growing soul begins to feel suffocated by the very relationships that once provided life and meaning. This suffocation is not anyone's fault. The other person has not necessarily done anything wrong, nor have you. The container was appropriate for who you both were when it was established, but containers, unlike living things, do not grow. They maintain their shape, their size, their boundaries regardless of whether their contents continue to fit, and when the contents outgrow the container, something has to give. Often the first response to this growing discomfort is an attempt to make the relationship work by forcing yourself back into the familiar patterns, squeezing your expanded consciousness back into the original container. You might find yourself editing your thoughts, dimming your insights, suppressing your growth in an effort to maintain the connection. This is the psychological equivalent of binding your feet to keep them small, a painful contortion that serves no one's authentic development. This self-suppression can work temporarily, but it exacts a tremendous cost. Each time you shrink yourself to fit into an outgrown relationship, you betray your own evolution. Each time you pretend to be smaller than you are, you reinforce patterns of inauthenticity that your growth process is working to dissolve. Each time you prioritize relational harmony over personal integrity, you participate in the very unconsciousness that your awakening is meant to transcend. The alternative, honoring your growth even when it creates relational discomfort, feels equally painful but serves a different purpose. When you refuse to diminish yourself to fit into outgrown containers, you create the possibility for relationships to evolve or for new ones to emerge that can accommodate your authentic being. You also model for others the courage to outgrow their own limiting containers, even when that outgrowing requires difficult transitions. Some relationships possess an inherent elasticity that allows them to stretch and accommodate growth. These rare connections are characterized by mutual commitment to each person's authentic development, even when that development leads in unexpected directions. Both parties recognize that the relationship serves not to maintain static roles but to support dynamic becoming. The container itself becomes living, growing, expanding to accommodate the evolution of its contents. But many relationships lack this elasticity. They were formed around specific configurations of need, wound, and unconscious agreement that cannot survive the disruption of consciousness expansion. These relationships may have served essential purposes in your development, providing safety during vulnerable periods, offering companionship through difficult transitions, mirroring back aspects of yourself that you needed to see, but their purpose may now be complete, even if their ending feels like loss rather than graduation. The grief of outgrowing relationships is complicated by the fact that there's often nothing obviously wrong with what you're leaving behind. The people may be kind, the memories may be precious, the history may be rich with meaning, but kindness alone cannot bridge the gap between different levels of consciousness. Precious memories cannot sustain a relationship when present moment connection becomes impossible. Rich history cannot compensate for an impoverished future. This is why the outgrowing process often feels like betrayal, both to others and to yourself. You're not leaving because you've been mistreated, or because others have failed you. You're leaving because you've grown beyond what the relationship can contain, and continuing to force the connection would require you to betray the very growth that brought you to this threshold. The tree that outgrows its pot is not rejecting the container that once nurtured it. It's simply acknowledging that continued growth requires transplantation to a larger space. The butterfly that emerges from its chrysalis is not abandoning its former home out of ingratitude, but responding to the biological imperative to spread wings that cannot unfold in confined spaces. Your outgrowing of relationships follows the same natural law. It's not a rejection of what was, but an affirmation of what is becoming. It's not a statement that previous connections were meaningless, but recognition that meaning itself evolves as consciousness expands. It's not abandonment, but expansion. Not betrayal, but growth. Not ending, but transformation. The pain of this process is real and should be honored. There's grief in recognizing that love isn't always enough, that good intentions cannot always bridge developmental gaps, that some connections have natural lifespans that must be respected. There's sorrow in disappointing people you care about, in being misunderstood by those who know you well, in watching confusion and hurt spread across familiar faces as you become someone they no longer recognize. But there's also liberation in this recognition. The energy you've been spending, trying to force yourself into outgrown containers, becomes available for creating new relationships that can accommodate your authentic being. The emotional resources you've been investing in maintaining incompatible connections can be redirected toward nurturing relationships that celebrate rather than constrain your evolution. And sometimes, remarkably, the act of honoring your own growth gives others permission to acknowledge their own outgrowing. Sometimes your courage to leave the too small container inspires others to examine their own containers, to question their own limitations, to consider their own possibilities for expansion. Sometimes what appears to be the end of relationship actually becomes the beginning of a deeper, more authentic connection, based on who you both are becoming, rather than who you both were. The container you've outgrown was not a mistake. It served its purpose, provided its support, offered its particular gifts to your development, but continuing to inhabit a space that no longer fits would be the true betrayal, a betrayal of your own growth, your own potential, your own becoming. The tree that stays in the too small pot doesn't demonstrate loyalty. It demonstrates a tragic misunderstanding of what loyalty to one's own nature actually requires. Your authentic self is too precious to keep hidden in containers that cannot showcase its full dimensions. Your evolving consciousness is too vital to suppress for the sake of relationships that can only survive your smallness. Your growing soul is too important to constrain for the comfort of those who prefer you to remain contained. The outgrown container must be left behind, not in anger or judgment, but with gratitude for what it provided and excitement for what lies ahead. Your roots have spread, your canopy has expanded, your essence has evolved. Now it's time to find soil spacious enough to accommodate all of who you're becoming. Relationships elastic enough to grow with your growing, connections deep enough to nourish the tree you're meant to be. As your consciousness expands into territories previously unexplored, you begin to develop what can only be called a new language, not merely new words, though those certainly emerge, but an entirely different way of conceptualizing reality, processing experience, and expressing the deepest truths of your being. This linguistic evolution is as natural as a child learning to speak, yet far more complex, for you are not simply acquiring vocabulary, but developing the capacity to articulate dimensions of existence that your former self could neither perceive nor comprehend. This new language emerges from the depths of your transformative experience, like water rising from an underground spring. Words that once felt foreign on your tongue, words like consciousness, authenticity, shadow, projection, individuation begin to feel not just familiar but essential, the only adequate vessels for carrying the insights that have become central to your existence. Concepts that your former self might have dismissed as abstract philosophy or spiritual jargon now pulse with lived meaning, each term carrying the weight of personal discovery and hard-won wisdom. But this linguistic transformation creates an unexpected and often painful side effect. You find yourself increasingly unable to communicate with those who have not undergone their own inner journey. The language that feels most natural to you, the vocabulary of awakening, the grammar of growth, the syntax of soul sounds foreign, pretentious, or incomprehensible to ears that have not been tuned by similar experience. You are like an explorer returned from a distant land, attempting to describe landscapes that your audience has never seen and perhaps never imagined. The frustration of this communication gap cannot be overstated. You want to share the revelations that have transformed your life, to offer the insights that might illuminate others' paths, to bridge the growing distance between your evolving consciousness and their familiar concerns. But the very words that carry your deepest truths seem to create confusion rather than clarity, distance rather than connection, suspicion rather than curiosity. When you speak of taking responsibility for your own projections, others hear judgment of their tendency to blame external circumstances. When you discuss the importance of shadow work, others interpret this as an obsession with negativity. When you explore the difference between ego and authentic self, others perceive arrogance or pretension. When you reference the journey of individuation, others wonder when you became so self-absorbed. This linguistic divide reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Different levels of awareness literally create different realities, different ways of passing experience, different frameworks for understanding what it means to be human. The language that emerges from expanded consciousness is not simply a new way of talking about old things. It's an attempt to articulate entirely new categories of experience, new dimensions of reality, new possibilities for human being. Jung encountered this challenge throughout his career as he attempted to create psychological language adequate to the depths he had explored. Terms like the collective unconscious, archetypes, and synchronicity were not academic exercises, but desperate attempts to give form to formless experiences, to make communicable the incommunicable territories of the psyche. He knew that without adequate language, the most profound insights remain trapped in individual experience, unable to contribute to the larger evolution of human understanding. But developing this new language is only half the challenge. The other half is learning to navigate the reactions it provokes in those who hear it as foreign, threatening, or pretentious. Your expanded vocabulary becomes another form of mirror, reflecting back others' relationship to growth, change, and the unknown. Some hear your new language and become curious, sensing possibility they had not previously imagined. But many hear it and become defensive, interpreting your evolved expression as implicit criticism of their more familiar ways of speaking and thinking. The tragedy is that the very language that could most benefit those around you, the concepts that might illuminate their own unconscious patterns, the insights that could accelerate their own growth, the perspectives that might liberate them from limiting beliefs, becomes inaccessible precisely because it emerges from a level of consciousness they have not yet accessed themselves. It's as if you're offering water to those who are thirsty but speaking of it in terms they cannot understand, using words they perceive as evidence of your separation from rather than your desire for connection with them. This linguistic isolation is compounded by the fact that the concepts most essential to your new understanding often have no adequate equivalent in ordinary language. How do you explain the experience of ego dissolution to someone who has never questioned their identification with personality? How do you describe the liberation of shadow integration to someone who insists they have no shadow? How do you communicate the joy of authentic being to someone who doesn't realize they've been performing a role? The inadequacy of ordinary language to capture extraordinary experience is an ancient problem. Mystics have always struggled to articulate their encounters with the ineffable. Artists continually push against the boundaries of their media to express the inexpressible. Lovers find themselves wordless before the enormity of their feeling. But for the individual undergoing psychological transformation, this linguistic limitation becomes a daily source of frustration and isolation. You find yourself caught between worlds, no longer able to speak the old language with conviction, not yet fluent enough in the new language to use it with confidence. In conversations with others, you feel like a translator working between languages, where many concepts simply don't exist in the target tongue. You search for ways to convey your meaning without using words that will trigger automatic resistance, trying to smuggle insights across the border of consciousness, disguised in more familiar terminology. Sometimes this translation works. You find ways to speak about responsibility without using the word projection, to discuss authentic being without mentioning ego, to explore unconscious patterns without invoking shadow. But even when the words are acceptable, the concepts themselves may be too threatening, too challenging to established worldviews, too disruptive of comfortable illusions. Other times, you abandon the attempt at translation altogether and simply speak your truth in its natural language, accepting that it may not be understood, may be misinterpreted, may even be rejected. This choice requires a particular kind of courage, the willingness to be seen as strange, pretentious, or deluded, rather than diminish your authentic expression to fit others' comfort zones. The loneliness of this linguistic exile is profound. Language is not just communication but community, not just expression but connection, not just meaning but belonging. When your natural way of speaking alienates you from others, when your most authentic expression becomes a source of distance rather than intimacy, when your deepest insights cannot be shared because they cannot be heard, you face a form of isolation that cuts to the core of human social need. Yet this linguistic evolution serves an essential purpose in your development. The new language is not merely descriptive, but constitutive. It doesn't just describe your new reality but actually helps create it. The concepts you're learning to articulate become tools for further exploration, maps for continued navigation, containers for ongoing growth. Each new word you integrate expands your capacity to perceive, to understand, to evolve. Moreover, the process of developing this new language deepens your relationship with your own experience. The struggle to find words adequate to your insights forces you to examine those insights more carefully, to refine your understanding, to distinguish between genuine realization and mere conceptual inflation. The vocabulary of consciousness becomes a discipline of consciousness, a practice that cultivates both clarity and humility, and gradually, mysteriously, you begin to encounter others who speak this same new language, fellow travelers who have also ventured into the territories you're exploring, who recognize the concepts you're articulating, who can not only understand but contribute to the conversation you've been longing to have. These encounters feel like profound relief, like finally being able to breathe freely after holding your breath for a very long time. These connections reveal that the language you thought was isolating you was actually calling your tribe to you. The very words that created distance from some created magnetic attraction to others. The concepts that seemed to alienate you from your former community were simultaneously drawing you toward your true community. Those rare souls who share not just your vocabulary, but your commitment to the realities that vocabulary attempts to capture. You begin to understand that every authentic language of consciousness serves not just personal expression but collective evolution. The words you're learning to speak, the concepts you're struggling to embody, the insights you're working to articulate, all of this contributes to the larger project of expanding human language to encompass human possibility. You are participating in the ancient and ongoing process by which consciousness expands its capacity for self-reflection and self-expression. The linguistic divide you experience is not a permanent exile, but a temporary bridge phase. As more individuals undertake their own journeys of awakening, the language of consciousness gradually infiltrates ordinary discourse. Concepts that once seemed esoteric become commonplace. Vocabulary that once marked you as different becomes part of the general lexicon. Ideas that once isolated you from the mainstream eventually help transform the mainstream itself. But for now, in this transitional phase, you must learn to live between languages, to speak multiple dialects of human experience, to translate between different levels of consciousness, with patience, skill, and compassion. You must develop the wisdom to know when translation is possible and when it's futile, when to persist in your attempts at communication, and when to accept the limitations of linguistic connection. Most importantly, you must resist the temptation to abandon your new language simply because others don't understand it. The words you're learning to speak are not pretensions but necessities, not affectations but accurate expressions of your lived reality. To suppress this emerging vocabulary would be to suppress the very consciousness that gave birth to it, to betray the evolution that is your deepest truth. Your new language is simultaneously gift and burden, liberation and isolation, expression and evolution. It marks your entry into territories of human experience that remain largely unexplored, dimensions of consciousness that are still emerging in human development. You are learning to speak not just with your own voice, but with the voice of consciousness itself, as it struggles to know itself more fully, express itself more completely, and evolve itself more consciously through your individual journey of awakening. There is a quality of light that emerges from the depths of genuine transformation, not the harsh fluorescence of intellectual understanding, nor the warm glow of surface positivity, but something far more penetrating and unsettling. This is the radiance of consciousness that has metabolized its own shadows, integrated its own contradictions, faced its own illusions with unflinching honesty. It emanates from you now like an invisible flame, illuminating not only your own path, but casting its revealing beams into every corner of your relational landscape, whether invited or not. This light is not something you can control, dim or extinguish at will. It has become as much a part of your being as the beat of your heart or the rhythm of your breath, born from the alchemical fires of your inner work. It represents the natural luminosity that emerges when consciousness stops hiding from itself, when authenticity replaces performance, when presence becomes more important than pretense. You have become a kind of human lighthouse, broadcasting clarity into waters where others have grown comfortable navigating by the dim stars of familiar illusion. The uncomfortable truth about this light is that it reveals everything it touches, not just the beauty and potential that others carry, but also the shadows they work so hard to keep hidden, the wounds they refuse to acknowledge, the patterns they insist don't exist. Your very presence becomes a form of involuntary illumination, casting stark relief on the careful constructions of denial, projection, and self-deception that form the architecture of unconscious living. When you enter a room now, something shifts in the energetic field. Conversations that were flowing smoothly moments before begin to feel hollow or forced. People find themselves saying things they didn't intend to say, revealing aspects of themselves they usually keep carefully concealed. The light of your consciousness creates a kind of truth field that makes pretense difficult to maintain, masks uncomfortable to wear, and authentic expression almost irresistible. This is not something you're doing to others. It's something your transformed presence evokes from them, like a tuning fork that causes other instruments to resonate at their natural frequency. Your embodied authenticity calls forth whatever is most real in those around you, but many people have grown so identified with their personas, so attached to their carefully crafted presentations of self, that this calling forth of their authentic nature feels threatening rather than liberating. The light you emanate penetrates the comfortable fog of collective unconsciousness in which most people live their daily lives. It illuminates the gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are, between what they claim to value and how they actually behave, between their stated beliefs and their unconscious patterns. This revelation is often deeply disturbing to those who have invested enormous energy in maintaining these gaps, who have built their entire sense of identity around the stories they tell themselves about themselves. Jung understood this phenomenon through his own experience of becoming a bearer of uncomfortable light. His penetrating insights into human psychology, his willingness to explore the darkest corners of the psyche, his refusal to accept surface explanations for complex behaviors. All of this made him both compelling and disturbing to those around him. People were simultaneously drawn to his clarity and repelled by what that clarity revealed about their own unconscious patterns. The discomfort your light creates in others manifests in predictable ways. Some people become inexplicably agitated in your presence, as if your very being is challenging beliefs they're not even aware they hold. They may find fault with things about you that never bothered them before, criticize choices you make that don't affect them, or become defensive about topics you haven't even raised. Your light is showing them aspects of themselves they're not ready to see, and their reaction is to try to extinguish the source of illumination rather than examine what it reveals. Others may become strangely confessional around you, sharing intimate details of their lives, admitting to struggles they usually keep private, or seeking advice about problems they've never discussed with anyone. Your light creates a safety that invites vulnerability, but this same vulnerability may later cause them embarrassment or regret. They may blame you for making them reveal more than they intended, as if your presence somehow manipulated them into honesty rather than simply created conditions where honesty became natural. Still others may interpret your light as judgment, perceiving your clarity as criticism, your authenticity as arrogance, your growth as an implicit condemnation of their stagnation. They experience your refusal to participate in collective illusions as an attack on their right to remain unconscious. Your commitment to truth becomes, in their perception, a form of aggression against their commitment to comfortable fiction. This is perhaps the most painful aspect of carrying this uncomfortable light, watching people you care about experience your greatest gift, your hard-won consciousness as your greatest flaw. The very qualities that represent your deepest healing and highest development are often perceived as your most troubling characteristics. Your boundary setting becomes being difficult. Your authenticity becomes thinking you're better than everyone else. Your refusal to enable unconscious patterns becomes not caring about the relationship. The psychological mechanism at work here is projection, in its most classic form. Unable to acknowledge their own discomfort with consciousness, their own resistance to growth, their own attachment to unconscious patterns, others project these shadows onto you. You become the repository for everything they cannot accept about themselves, their own unlived potential, their own avoided growth, their own unclaimed authenticity. But projection is a two-way process, and the light you carry also illuminates your own remaining shadows, your own unintegrated aspects, your own areas of continued unconsciousness. The very clarity that disturbs others often reveals to you the places where your own vision remains clouded, where your own patterns remain unexamined, where your own growth edges lie waiting for attention. This can be profoundly humbling. Just when you think you've achieved some level of awakening, your light shows you how much further you still have to go. Just when you feel confident in your consciousness, you encounter someone whose light reveals your own remaining shadows. The illumination that makes you a disturbing presence to some makes you a vulnerable student to others. The challenge becomes learning to carry this light with both confidence and humility, to honor its revelatory power while remaining open to what it reveals about your own continuing evolution. You must develop the capacity to shine your truth without becoming attached to others' reactions to it, to illuminate without judging what you uncover, to maintain your clarity without losing your compassion for those still finding their way in the darkness. This requires a particular kind of spiritual maturity, the ability to hold space for both light and shadow, both consciousness and unconsciousness, both growth and resistance. You learn to love people not despite their shadows, but because of their wholeness, including the parts of themselves they cannot yet accept. You develop what might be called enlightened compassion, understanding that everyone is exactly where they need to be in their journey, even when that place is far from where you hope they might eventually arrive. The light you carry also attracts certain people like a beacon in the night. Those who are ready for their own awakening find themselves drawn to your presence, even if they cannot initially articulate why. They sense in you a quality they hunger for in themselves: authenticity, clarity, the courage to be real in a world that rewards pretense. These souls become your companions on the journey, fellow carriers of uncomfortable light, who understand both its gifts and its burdens. These relationships, forged in the fire of mutual recognition, sustained by shared commitment to consciousness, possess a quality unlike any you've known before. They are not based on mutual projection, shared unconsciousness, or familiar dysfunction, but on mutual support for each other's continued awakening. They create a new kind of intimacy, the intimacy of souls who are willing to see and be seen completely, who support each other's light even when it reveals uncomfortable truths. But even these relationships must navigate the challenges that come with carrying uncomfortably revealing light. Learning to shine your truth without overwhelming others becomes an art form. Developing the wisdom to know when illumination serves and when it harms becomes essential. Cultivating the capacity to be authentic without being harsh, honest without being cruel, clear without being coldly detached. These become the ongoing practices of the conscious life. The uncomfortable light you carry is not a burden to be endured, but a gift to be stewarded wisely. It represents the fruit of your inner work, the evidence of your transformation, the natural radiance of a consciousness that has stopped hiding from itself. This light serves not just your own continued evolution, but the evolution of consciousness itself, contributing to the gradual illumination of human potential that unfolds through individual awakening. Yet you must learn to carry this light without becoming identified with it, to appreciate its power without becoming inflated by it, to honor its revelatory capacity without becoming attached to controlling its effects. The light shines through you, not from you. You are its vessel, not its source. Your task is to remain transparent to its passage, clear in its expression, humble in its presence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to dim your light slightly, to speak your truth gently, to reveal your insights gradually. Other times the most loving thing is to shine fully, regardless of others' discomfort, allowing your light to serve its natural function of illumination even when that illumination disturbs rather than comforts. Learning to navigate these choices with wisdom rather than reactivity, love rather than judgment, consciousness rather than unconsciousness. This becomes the ongoing practice of the awakened life. You are learning to be a responsible bearer of uncomfortable light, understanding that with great illumination comes great responsibility, not just for your own continued evolution, but for the thoughtful, compassionate sharing of consciousness with a world that desperately needs more light, even when it thinks it prefers the darkness. The light you carry is both gift and initiation, blessing and burden, illumination and responsibility. It marks your graduation from unconscious living and your matriculation into the advanced curriculum of conscious being. You are learning to shine, not to blind, but to reveal, not to judge, but to clarify, not to separate, but to integrate. You are becoming a servant of consciousness itself, a bearer of the uncomfortable light that consciousness needs to see itself more clearly, know itself more fully, and evolve itself more consciously through your unique expression of its infinite potential. In the deepest chambers of human relationship lies an unspoken covenant, a loyalty pact, written not in words, but in the very fabric of how we come together, stay together, and define what it means to belong. This covenant whispers its terms in every family gathering, every friendship formed, every romantic bond forged. We will remain who we are, for each other, We will not grow beyond our agreed-upon roles. We will not evolve past our familiar patterns. We will preserve the comfortable predictability that allows others to know exactly who we are and what they can expect from us. To violate this covenant, to grow beyond its boundaries, to become more than the relationship originally contracted for, this is the ultimate betrayal, the unforgivable sin of authentic development. And yet, here you stand, at the threshold of your own becoming, faced with the impossible choice that every evolving soul must eventually confront. Remain loyal to others' need for your smallness, or commit the revolutionary act of being loyal to your own growth. This is the loyalty test that consciousness places before every individual brave enough to undertake the journey of authentic development. A test with no right answers, only honest ones. No painless choices, only necessary ones. The loyalty demanded by unconscious relationship is a peculiar kind of faithfulness. It asks not that you be true to your highest self, but that you remain true to your smallest self. It requests not that you honor your potential, but that you honor your limitations. It insists not that you grow into who you might become, but that you remain exactly who you were when the relationship began. This loyalty is less about love and more about control, less about support and more about stagnation, less about authentic connection and more about mutual enablement of unconscious patterns. You begin to recognize this loyalty test in the subtle pressures that emerge whenever you start to change. The family member who expresses concern about your new ideas, not because they're harmful, but because they're different. The friend who jokes about your phase whenever you express enthusiasm for your growth. The partner who claims to support your evolution while subtly sabotaging every step you take toward authentic self-expression. The colleague who praises your reliability while discouraging any initiative that might disrupt established patterns. These pressures feel like love, sound like care, present themselves as concern for your well-being. But underneath their benevolent surface lies a more primitive demand. Do not grow beyond what we can understand. Do not become more than we can handle. Do not evolve past what we need you to be. The loyalty being requested is not loyalty to your relationship, but loyalty to your mutual limitations, not faithfulness to your connection, but faithfulness to your shared unconsciousness. This is the cruel paradox of growth within relationship. The very development that makes you more authentically yourself often makes you less recognizable to those who thought they knew you. Your expansion beyond familiar patterns feels to them like abandonment of everything that made you valuable in their lives. Your refusal to continue playing roles that no longer fit feels like rejection of the roles they still need you to play. Your commitment to becoming who you truly are feels like betrayal of who they need you to remain. Jung understood this loyalty test intimately through his own navigation of relationships that could not accommodate his psychological development. His break with Freud, his conflicts with colleagues who could not follow him into the territories he was exploring, his struggles with family members who wanted him to remain the conventional psychiatrist rather than become the depth psychologist he was called to be. All of these reflected the fundamental tension between loyalty to others and loyalty to one's own authentic development. The test becomes particularly acute when you realize that your growth threatens not just individual relationships, but entire systems of mutual dependency. Families organize themselves around certain members playing certain roles: the caretaker, the responsible one, the problem child, the peacemaker. When the caretaker begins to set boundaries, when the responsible one starts prioritizing their own needs, when the problem child begins to heal, when the peacemaker refuses to enable dysfunction, the entire family system feels threatened with collapse. The loyalty being demanded in these moments is loyalty to dysfunction, faithfulness to limitation, commitment to keeping the system stable rather than supporting its evolution. You are being asked to sacrifice your authentic development for the sake of maintaining familiar patterns, to remain small so that others can continue to avoid their own growth, to stay sick so that the system doesn't have to become healthy. This same dynamic plays out in friendships built around shared complaints, mutual cynicism, or collective victimhood. When you begin to take responsibility for your own life, to find solutions rather than dwelling on problems, to choose empowerment over blame, the foundation of these relationships begins to crack. Your former friends interpret your growth as judgment of their stagnation, your increasing positivity as abandonment of your shared negativity, your personal empowerment as betrayal of your mutual powerlessness. The workplace presents its own version of the loyalty test. Organizations often reward conformity over creativity, compliance over innovation, keeping your head down over standing up for authentic values. When you begin to question established procedures that don't serve anyone, to suggest improvements that might require others to change, to live your values even when they conflict with organizational culture, you face the loyalty test in its professional form. Remain who we hired you to be, or risk being seen as disloyal to the corporate family. Romantic relationships may present the most complex version of this test. Partners often fall in love with specific versions of each other. The wounded person who needs rescuing, the reliable person who provides security, the fun person who avoids serious topics, the strong person who never shows vulnerability. When healing begins to occur, when reliability starts including self-care, when fun includes depth, when strength embraces authentic feeling, the entire foundation of the romantic connection may feel threatened. The partner who fell in love with your neediness may feel abandoned when you become self-sufficient. The partner who was attracted to your stability may feel rejected when you start taking emotional risks. The partner who enjoyed your easygoing nature may feel betrayed when you develop stronger boundaries. In each case, your growth feels to them like violation of an unspoken agreement about who you would be for each other. The loyalty test reaches its most painful intensity when it comes from those we love most deeply. Parents who gave everything to raise you a certain way may feel that your evolution beyond their values and beliefs constitutes rejection of their love and sacrifice. Children who depended on you to be a certain kind of parent may struggle when your own growth changes how you show up in the relationship. Spouses who built their identity around being needed in specific ways may feel discarded when your development makes those needs obsolete. In these moments, the test becomes excruciating. Choose your growth or choose their comfort. Choose your authenticity or choose their approval. Choose who you're becoming or choose who they need you to remain. The pain lies in recognizing that both choices involve loss. Remain small and lose yourself. Grow authentic and lose them, at least temporarily, perhaps permanently. But here is what the loyalty test ultimately reveals. True loyalty, authentic faithfulness, genuine love cannot be built on the foundation of mutual limitation. Real relationship must be able to accommodate growth, celebrate evolution, support transformation. Any connection that requires your diminishment for its survival is not truly serving love, but serving fear. Fear of change, fear of growth, fear of the unknown territories that authentic development always opens. The most loyal thing you can do for yourself is to honor your own growth. The most faithful choice you can make is faithfulness to your own authentic development. The most loving act is to love yourself enough to become who you truly are, regardless of how others react to that becoming. This is not selfish love, but sacred love. Not narcissistic development, but necessary development. Not abandonment of relationship, but invitation to deeper relationship. True loyalty to others includes being loyal to the highest potential within them, even when they cannot see or embrace that potential themselves. When you choose your own growth, you model the possibility of growth for everyone around you. When you refuse to remain small, you implicitly invite others to consider their own possibilities for expansion. When you commit to authentic development, you demonstrate that such development is possible, even when it's difficult, even when it's misunderstood, even when it's lonely. Sometimes this loyalty to growth does require disappointing those who prefer your limitation. Sometimes it does mean letting others experience the discomfort of your evolution. Sometimes it does involve saying no to their requests for your smallness and yes to your own call toward largeness. This is not cruelty but compassion. The deep compassion that refuses to enable unconsciousness, that declines to participate in mutual stagnation, that chooses truth over harmony when the two are in conflict. The loyalty test also reveals the difference between relationships that can grow with you and relationships that can only survive your stagnation. Some connections possess the elasticity to accommodate change, the wisdom to celebrate evolution, the love to support transformation even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. These relationships deepen through your growth, becoming more authentic, more meaningful, more genuinely supportive. Other relationships reveal themselves to be more like contracts than connections, agreements that you'll provide certain services, play certain roles, remain within certain boundaries, in exchange for acceptance, approval, or artificial security. When you begin to outgrow these contracts, when your development makes the old terms untenable, the relationship faces a choice: evolve or dissolve. The grief of relationships that choose dissolution over evolution is real and should be honored. There's genuine loss in discovering that connections you thought were deep were actually conditional, that love you believed was unconditional was actually contingent on your remaining unchanged, that acceptance you treasured was actually dependent on your continued limitation. But there's also liberation in this discovery. The energy you've been investing in maintaining relationships that required your smallness becomes available for nurturing connections that celebrate your largeness. The emotional resources you've been spending on preserving others' comfort with your limitation can be redirected towards supporting your own continued growth and finding others who share your commitment to authentic development. The loyalty test, for all its pain, serves an essential function in your evolution. It forces you to clarify your deepest values, to choose between competing loyalties, to decide what you're ultimately willing to sacrifice for growth and what you're willing to sacrifice to avoid growth. It reveals the courage or fear that lies at the center of your being, the degree of commitment you have to your own authentic development. Passing this test doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others' feelings or callous about the impact of your growth on relationships. It means developing the wisdom to distinguish between appropriate consideration for others and inappropriate sacrifice of yourself. It means learning to be sensitive to others' reactions without being controlled by them, to care about their feelings without being enslaved by them. The ultimate loyalty is loyalty to consciousness itself, to the evolution of awareness that serves not just your individual development, but the development of the whole human family. When you choose your own growth, you serve the growth of consciousness. When you commit to your own authenticity, you contribute to the field of authenticity available to everyone. When you pass the loyalty test by being faithful to your own becoming, you demonstrate that such faithfulness is possible, inspiring others to consider their own relationship to growth, change, and authentic development. This is the revolutionary nature of personal evolution. It's never just personal. Your individual commitment to growth becomes a gift to the collective. Your personal passage through the loyalty test becomes a pathway others can follow. Your individual courage to choose becoming over belonging becomes an invitation for others to make the same sacred choice. The loyalty test will come again and again throughout your journey of awakening, each time presenting new choices, new opportunities to choose growth over stagnation, authenticity over approval, becoming over belonging. Each time you face this test, you have the opportunity to deepen your commitment to your own evolution, to strengthen your capacity to love yourself enough to become yourself, to demonstrate your ultimate loyalty to the magnificent potential that consciousness is seeking to express through your unique and irreplaceable existence. As you walk the path of conscious evolution, you discover that you have become something unexpected and often overwhelming, a blank canvas upon which others paint their most vivid psychological dramas, a neutral screen onto which they project their deepest fears, their most cherished fantasies, their unlived potential, and their carefully guarded shame. This transformation into a projection screen is not something you choose or can easily avoid. It emerges naturally from the process of withdrawing your own projections and becoming more psychologically transparent, more authentically present, more genuinely yourself. The irony is profound. The more clearly you see yourself, the more others mistake you for reflections of their own internal landscape. The more integrated you become, the more others fragment you into pieces that match their unintegrated parts. The more authentic your presence, the more others relate to you not as who you actually are, but as who their unconscious needs you to be. You have become a kind of psychological Rorschach test, where what others see reveals far more about their inner world than it does about your outer reality. This phenomenon occurs because consciousness abhors a vacuum, and your growing psychological transparency creates a kind of energetic void that others unconsciously rush to fill with their own unexamined content. Where once you might have presented a cluttered persona full of unconscious patterns, defensive strategies, and projected material that others could relate to in familiar ways, you now offer a clearer, more open presence that invites projection precisely because it doesn't insist on being seen in any particular way. Jung understood this dynamic intimately, both through his clinical work with patients who consistently projected archetypal material onto him, and through his personal relationships with colleagues, friends, and family who seemed unable to see him as he actually was rather than as their unconscious needs required him to be. He recognized that becoming more conscious inevitably meant becoming a container for others' unconsciousness, a repository for all the psychological material they could not yet acknowledge or integrate within themselves. The projections you receive form a complex kaleidoscope of others' internal dramas. Some see in you the idealized parent they never had, expecting you to provide unconditional love, perfect understanding, and endless patience without reciprocal consideration for your own needs or limitations. They may become devastated when you fail to live up to this impossible standard, interpreting your humanity as betrayal, your boundaries as rejection, your own needs as selfishness. Others project onto you the critical parent who wounded them, interpreting your honesty as judgment, your clarity as condemnation, your authentic self-expression as attack on their carefully constructed defenses. They may react to your presence with defensive anger, preemptive hostility, or elaborate justifications for behaviors you never questioned. In their psychological theater, you have been cast as the harsh critic, regardless of your actual intentions or expressions. Still others see in you the perfect friend, lover, or mentor they have always longed for, projecting onto you qualities of wisdom, strength, or understanding that exist more in their imagination than in your reality. They may become obsessed with gaining your approval, devastated by your unavailability, or resentful when you prove to be human rather than the idealized figure they needed you to be. Your ordinariness becomes extraordinary disappointment. Your limitations become personal betrayal. Perhaps most challenging are those who project their own unlived potential onto you, seeing in your growth and development a reflection of possibilities they have denied within themselves. Your commitment to consciousness becomes evidence of your arrogance. Your willingness to grow becomes proof of your selfishness. Your authentic self-expression becomes demonstration of your superiority complex. They cannot acknowledge these qualities as potentials within themselves, so they must either idealize or demonize them when they encounter them in you. The projection screen you have become also attracts those who need to see their own shadows reflected in external form. Your clarity becomes their projection of coldness. Your boundaries become their projection of cruelty. Your refusal to enable dysfunction becomes their projection of heartlessness. Your commitment to truth becomes their projection of rigidity. Unable to acknowledge these shadow qualities within themselves, they must locate them somewhere outside, and your growing consciousness makes you a convenient target. This projective bombardment can be profoundly disorienting, especially in the early stages when you haven't yet learned to distinguish between accurate feedback about your behavior and projective material that belongs to others. You may find yourself defending against accusations you never earned, apologizing for behaviors you never exhibited, or trying to prove you're not the person others insist you are. The gap between how you experience yourself and how others experience you can become so vast that you begin to question your own perceptions, your own reality, your own sense of self. Learning to navigate this projective field without losing your center becomes one of the essential skills of conscious living. You must develop what might be called projective immunity, the capacity to remain stable in your own identity while others attempt to redefine you according to their unconscious needs. This requires a kind of psychological sovereignty that allows you to acknowledge others' perceptions without internalizing them, to consider feedback without automatically accepting it, to remain open to growth without becoming enslaved to others' projections of who you should be. The process of developing this immunity is complicated by the fact that projections often contain grains of truth, mixed with large quantities of distortion. Someone may accurately perceive a quality you possess while completely misinterpreting its meaning or intention. They may correctly identify a pattern in your behavior while projecting entirely wrong motivations for that pattern. Learning to separate the accurate perception from the projective interpretation requires a level of discernment that can only be developed through experience and often painful trial and error. You begin to recognize the signs of projection, responses that seem disproportionate to your actual behavior, reactions that appear to be about events or statements that never occurred, emotions that seem to belong to someone else's story rather than your shared history. You learn to ask yourself, is this response about something I actually did or said? Or is this person responding to something from their own past, their own fears, their own unlived life that they're seeing reflected in me? This recognition brings both relief and responsibility. Relief because you realize that much of the criticism, idealization, or confusion directed toward you isn't actually about you. It's about others' internal landscape being projected onto your external presence. Responsibility because you recognize that your role as projection screen, while not chosen, carries certain ethical obligations about how you respond to others' projective material. The temptation, once you understand this dynamic, is to dismiss all feedback as projection, to insulate yourself behind the armor of "that's not about me, that's about them." But this defensive stance misses the deeper opportunity that serving as a projection screen provides. Others' projections, even when inaccurate, reveal something important about the effect your presence has in the world. They provide information about the energetic field you create, the archetypal forces you seem to embody, the unconscious material you activate in others. More importantly, the projections you receive often point toward your own remaining blind spots, your own unintegrated shadows, your own areas where continued growth is needed. The person who consistently sees arrogance in your confidence may be pointing towards subtle ways that your self-assurance tips into superiority. The person who experiences coldness in your clarity may be highlighting places where your intellectual understanding has outpaced your emotional integration. The person who perceives judgment in your discernment may be revealing areas where your wisdom needs to be tempered with compassion. Learning to use projective material as information rather than definition becomes an advanced practice of conscious living. You develop the capacity to receive others' perceptions as data, to be considered rather than truth, to be accepted or lies to be rejected. You learn to ask, what might be accurate in this feedback? What might be useful in this criticism? What might be valuable in this idealization? What might be important in this demonization? This process requires tremendous humility and emotional maturity. You must be willing to consider that even wildly inaccurate projections might contain seeds of truth about aspects of yourself you haven't yet recognized. You must develop the capacity to hold space for others' perceptions without being destroyed by them, to remain open to feedback without losing your center, to grow from criticism without sacrificing your authentic self-expression. The projection screen phenomenon also teaches you about the profound loneliness of the human condition. When you realize how rarely people actually see you as you are, how frequently they relate to you as a reflection of their own internal dramas, how consistently they mistake their projections for perceptions, you begin to understand the deep isolation that characterizes so much of human experience. Everyone is walking around in their own psychological movie, casting others in roles that serve their internal narratives rather than recognizing the independent reality of other beings. This recognition can lead to cynicism or compassion, depending on how you metabolize the insight. Cynicism sees others as hopelessly trapped in their projections, incapable of genuine perception, unworthy of authentic relationship. Compassion recognizes that this projective tendency is a universal human condition, that everyone is doing their best to navigate a complex psychological landscape with limited tools and incomplete awareness. Choosing compassion over cynicism becomes another essential skill for those who serve as projection screens. You learn to see others' projections as expressions of their wounds, their fears, their unlived potential rather than as attacks on your character or attempts to manipulate your behavior. You develop the capacity to remain loving toward people who cannot see you clearly, to maintain connection with those who relate to you projectively, to offer understanding to those who misunderstand you consistently. This doesn't mean accepting abuse or enabling unconscious behavior. It means maintaining your own center while holding space for others' projective process, offering clarity about your actual intentions and behaviors while not insisting that others immediately see or accept that clarity. It means being willing to serve as a container for others' psychological material, while maintaining clear boundaries about what you will and won't accept in terms of how that material is expressed. The projection screen you have become serves an important function in the collective psychological economy by providing a stable, clear presence onto which others can project their unconscious material. You create opportunities for them to see their own patterns more clearly. Your refusal to take their projections personally allows the material to remain visible long enough for recognition to potentially occur. Your commitment to remaining authentic despite their projective distortions provides a steady reference point against which they can eventually measure the accuracy of their perceptions. In this way, Serving as a projection screen becomes a form of service to consciousness itself. You are providing a function that supports others' potential for awakening, even when they're not ready to use that function constructively. You are offering a mirror that reflects back their unconscious material in ways that might eventually support their own growth and integration. But this service comes with costs that must be acknowledged and honored. The emotional labor of constantly distinguishing between accurate feedback and projective material is exhausting. The loneliness of rarely being seen clearly is profound. The frustration of being consistently misunderstood can be overwhelming. Learning to care for yourself while serving this function becomes essential for sustainable conscious living. You must learn to seek out relationships with others who can see you more clearly, who relate to you more directly, who offer the relief of being known rather than projected upon. You must develop practices that help you remember who you actually are when the world seems determined to tell you who you should be. You must cultivate the internal stability that allows you to remain centered in your own truth while serving as a container for others' unconscious projections. The projection screen you have become is not a permanent condition, but a transitional phase in your development and in the development of those around you. As you continue to grow in consciousness and others potentially follow their own paths of awakening, the projective intensity may gradually decrease. As people become more aware of their own projective tendencies, they may begin to relate to you more directly. As the general level of consciousness in your environment evolves, the need for projection screens may diminish. But for now, in this phase of your journey, you serve this essential function in the collective awakening process. You are learning to be a clear mirror that reflects back others' unconscious material while maintaining your own authentic presence. You are developing the capacity to remain yourself while allowing others to use you as a canvas for their psychological dramas. You are becoming skilled at serving consciousness through the paradoxical practice of being consistently misperceived while remaining steadfastly committed to being authentically seen. There comes a phase in every journey of conscious evolution when solitude transforms from circumstance into necessity, from isolation into initiation, from the absence of others into the presence of your deepest self. This is the sacred loneliness, not the hollow ache of abandonment or the bitter taste of rejection, but the profound quietude that serves as the cocoon for your most essential metamorphosis. Like the hermit in the ancient tarot, you find yourself called to withdraw from the external world, not out of misanthropy or defeat, but out of an inexorable need to meet yourself in the silence, to commune with the authentic self that can only emerge when the constant pressure to perform for others finally lifts. This sacred loneliness arrives not as punishment but as invitation, not as exile but as pilgrimage to the inner sanctum where your truest nature has been waiting, perhaps for decades, to be encountered without the mediating presence of others' expectations, projections, or needs. It is the hermitage phase of your psychological development, the necessary retreat that allows the butterfly to complete its transformation in the privacy of its chrysalis, away from the well-meaning but disruptive observations of those who knew it only as a caterpillar. The loneliness begins to feel sacred when you recognize it as chosen rather than imposed, as necessary rather than accidental, as fertile rather than barren. This is not the loneliness of the rejected but the solitude of the initiated, not the isolation of the abandoned but the withdrawal of the wise. You are entering the phase of your development that requires complete authenticity, and complete authenticity can only emerge in an environment free from the subtle but persistent pressure to be anything other than exactly who you are. This withdrawal often begins as a response to the growing incompatibility between your evolving consciousness and the relational dynamics that once felt natural. Conversations that used to energize you now drain you. Social gatherings that once provided connection now feel like elaborate performances. Even beloved friends and family members begin to feel like inhabitants of a world you're no longer sure you belong. The gap between your internal reality and the external social world becomes so vast that bridging it requires enormous effort, leaving you exhausted and somehow emptied rather than fulfilled. The sacred loneliness offers relief from this exhausting translation process. In solitude, you no longer need to explain your insights to those who lack the context to understand them. You no longer need to dim your light to avoid disturbing those who prefer darkness. You no longer need to edit your authentic expression to fit into conversations, relationships, or social situations that can only accommodate smaller versions of who you're becoming. The silence becomes spacious rather than empty, liberating rather than limiting. Jung understood this phase intimately through his own experience of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intensive inner work that required him to withdraw from many of his social and professional obligations to navigate the depths of his own psyche. He recognized that certain stages of individuation simply cannot occur in the presence of others, that some psychological territories can only be explored in complete solitude, that the most profound transformations require an environment free from external interference or interpretation. In this sacred loneliness, you begin to discover aspects of yourself that could never emerge in the presence of others. The thoughts that arise when you're not thinking about how others might judge them. The feelings that surface when you're not managing others' emotional reactions. The insights that crystallize when you're not translating them into language others can understand. The authentic expressions that flow when you're not editing them for social acceptability. The quiet voice of your deepest knowing that can only be heard when the clamor of others' voices finally stills. This is the loneliness of the artist in their studio, the mystic in their cave, the philosopher in their study, not the loneliness of the abandoned, but the solitude of the creative. You are creating yourself in this silence, sculpting your authentic being from the raw material of consciousness, without the helpful but ultimately limiting suggestions of others about what shape that sculpture should take. Every moment of this sacred aloneness is a moment of pure becoming, unmediated by the need to explain, justify or modify your evolution to accommodate others' comfort zones. The sacred quality of this loneliness lies in its revelatory power. Without the constant mirror of others' reactions to show you who you are, you must discover your identity from the inside out. Without the familiar roles and relationships that have long defined your sense of self, you must encounter who you are beyond all social construction. Without the external validation or criticism that has shaped your self-perception, you must learn to know yourself directly, intimately, authentically. This process can be initially terrifying. Who are you when no one is watching? What do you actually think when you're not considering others' opinions? What do you really want when you're not trying to please anyone else? What emerges when all the personas, all the adaptive strategies, all the learned behaviors designed to maintain connection fall away, leaving only the raw essence of your being? The silence holds these questions with infinite patience, waiting for you to develop the courage to meet their answers. In this sacred loneliness, you begin to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. Loneliness is the ache for connection that cannot be found. Aloneness is the fullness of connection with yourself. Loneliness is the feeling that something essential is missing. Aloneness is the recognition that everything essential is present within your own being. Loneliness seeks to fill an emptiness. Aloneness discovers the abundance that was always there, but obscured by the constant noise of social interaction. The sacred loneliness also serves as protection for your tender new growth. Like a gardener who provides a greenhouse environment for delicate seedlings, this phase of solitude creates optimal conditions for your emerging authentic self to strengthen its roots and stabilize its new form before being exposed to the potentially harsh elements of social interaction. Your new consciousness needs time to solidify. Your new insights need space to integrate. Your new way of being needs practice before it can withstand the inevitable challenges that come from engaging with others who may not understand or support your transformation. This protection is not permanent isolation but temporary incubation. Just as the butterfly must spend time in the chrysalis not because it will never fly but precisely because it will, your withdrawal into sacred loneliness serves your eventual return to relationship, but from a fundamentally different place. When you re-emerge from this cocoon phase, you will bring with you a quality of presence that wasn't available before, a depth of self-knowledge that wasn't possible in the constant company of others, an authenticity that couldn't develop under the watchful eyes of those who knew only your former self. The challenge of sacred loneliness lies in distinguishing it from the ego's tendency toward isolation as a defense against vulnerability. The ego withdraws to avoid being hurt, judged, or rejected. The soul withdraws to discover what cannot be discovered in company. The ego's isolation is based on fear and leads to further contraction. The soul's solitude is based on wisdom and leads to expansion. Learning to discern between these two forms of aloneness becomes essential for navigating this phase with integrity rather than defensiveness. Sacred loneliness often intensifies your relationship with the non-human world. In the absence of human conversation, you may find yourself drawn to longer dialogues with nature, deeper appreciation for art and music, more intimate relationship with books and ideas, more profound connection with spiritual practices or creative pursuits. These relationships, freed from the complexity of human psychology, offer forms of communion that nourish without depleting, inspire without demanding, connect without controlling. This phase also deepens your relationship with time itself, without the social obligations that once structured your days, without the conversations that filled your hours, without the meetings and gatherings that marked your calendar. You encounter time in its pure form, not as something to be managed or filled, but as space to be inhabited fully. You learn the rhythm of your own energy, the natural cycles of your creativity, the organic timing of your insights and breakthroughs. The sacred loneliness teaches you to be your own best company. You develop the capacity to entertain yourself, not through distraction but through genuine engagement with your own thoughts, feelings, and creative impulses. You learn to comfort yourself, not through external validation but through self-compassion and understanding. You discover how to inspire yourself, not through others' encouragement, but through connection with your own vision and purpose. This self-sufficiency is not selfishness, but preparation for deeper service. By learning to meet your own needs for understanding, validation, and companionship, you become less needy in your relationships with others, less demanding of what they should provide, more able to offer authentic gifts, rather than seeking to fulfill your own unmet needs through connection. The fullness you discover in solitude becomes the abundance you can share when you choose to engage with others again. The sacred loneliness also serves as a kind of reset for your relational patterns. Old dynamics that were based on mutual need, unconscious projection, or familiar dysfunction begin to fade when not actively maintained through ongoing interaction. Habits of people-pleasing, patterns of codependency, tendencies toward emotional reactivity, all of these begin to lose their grip when not regularly reinforced through social engagement. You emerge from this solitude not only knowing yourself more deeply, but freed from many of the unconscious relational patterns that once constrained your authentic expression. But perhaps most importantly, Sacred loneliness teaches you that your essential worth is not dependent on others' recognition. Your deepest insights are not validated by others' understanding, and your most authentic expression does not require others' approval. You learn to be whole unto yourself, not because you don't value connection, but because you understand that genuine connection can only emerge between two people who are already complete within themselves. This completeness is not closure, but openness, not the fortress of the defended ego, but the sanctuary of the integrated soul. When you know yourself so thoroughly that you need nothing from others to feel complete, you become capable of relating to them from abundance rather than lack, generosity rather than need, curiosity rather than demand. The sacred loneliness prepares you for a quality of relationship that wasn't available before because you weren't available before, not as a complete human being who chooses connection rather than someone who desperately needs it to feel whole. The hermit phase of your journey is temporary, but necessary, protective but not permanent, isolating but ultimately liberating. You are not becoming a recluse, but preparing to be a more conscious participant in human community. You are not abandoning relationship, but learning what authentic relationship requires. You are not choosing loneliness as a permanent lifestyle, but using it as a sacred tool for discovering who you are when all the external definitions and expectations fall away. In time, this sacred loneliness will naturally begin to open toward conscious community. Having met yourself in the silence, having discovered your authentic nature in solitude, having learned to be your own best company, you will be ready to offer the gift of your true presence to others who are capable of receiving it. But for now, the hermitage serves its essential purpose, creating the protected space where your deepest self can emerge, stabilize, and prepare for the next phase of your evolutionary journey. The sacred loneliness is not exile, but initiation, not abandonment, but appointment with your most essential self. Trust the cocoon. Honor the withdrawal. Embrace the silence. Your authentic self is forming in this solitude, and when it emerges, it will bring gifts to the world that could never have developed in the constant company of others. The sacred loneliness is not preparing you for a life of isolation, but for a quality of connection that can only arise from the depths of your own being, discovered and claimed in the fertile silence of your own sacred solitude. There is a moment in every transformative journey when you realize that something fundamental has shifted in the very frequency at which you vibrate, the energetic signature you broadcast into the world, the invisible harmonic that determines what and whom you attract into your experience. This shift is as natural and inevitable as a radio changing stations. One moment you're tuned to one reality, the next you're receiving signals from an entirely different wavelength. But unlike changing radio stations, this frequency shift happens from the inside out, emerging from the depths of your transformed consciousness rather than being imposed by external circumstances. This frequency shift operates according to the ancient and immutable law of resonance. Like calls to like, similar energies attract. Consciousness seeks its own level. As your inner landscape transforms through the alchemy of authentic development, you begin to emit a different vibrational signature that naturally aligns you with experiences, opportunities, and people who match your evolved state of being, while simultaneously creating discord with elements of your former reality that no longer resonate with who you're becoming. The shift is often so subtle at first that you might not notice it's happening. Perhaps you find yourself inexplicably drawn to places you never considered before. A bookstore specializing in topics that didn't interest your former self, a hiking trail that your old consciousness would have found boring, a meditation center you would previously have dismissed as too esoteric. Or maybe it's the opposite. Spaces that once felt comfortable now feel strangely discordant. Conversations that once engaged you now feel hollow. Activities that once brought pleasure now seem empty of meaning. But as your awareness of this frequency shift deepens, you begin to recognize its profound implications for every aspect of your existence. The law of resonance is reshaping your entire life experience, sorting your reality into what aligns with your new frequency and what belongs to the wavelength you've outgrown. This process is as automatic as breathing, as unconscious as gravity, yet as powerful as any force in the universe. Jung understood this phenomenon through his own experience of how psychological transformation naturally reorganized his external circumstances. As his consciousness evolved, he found himself gravitating toward different relationships, different interests, different ways of spending his time and energy. He recognized that consciousness doesn't just change your inner world, it literally restructures your outer world by shifting the magnetic field through which you attract and repel experiences. The frequency shift manifests most noticeably in your relationships. People who once felt like perfect matches, who shared your interests, understood your perspectives, enjoyed your company, may suddenly feel like you're operating on completely different wavelengths. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly now require tremendous effort to maintain. Shared activities that once brought joy now feel forced or artificial. The easy compatibility you once enjoyed has been replaced by a growing sense that you're speaking different languages, even when using the same words. This isn't anyone's fault, nor is it a judgment of their worth or value as human beings. It's simply the natural consequence of consciousness operating at different frequencies. Just as two radio stations broadcasting on different wavelengths cannot occupy the same space without creating static and interference, two people operating at significantly different levels of consciousness cannot maintain the same quality of connection they once enjoyed. The discomfort of this realization can be profound. These may be people you love deeply, relationships you've invested years or decades in building, connections that have been central to your sense of identity and belonging. To discover that your frequency shift has created an energetic incompatibility can feel like loss, like betrayal, like somehow you've done something wrong by growing beyond the familiar patterns that once bound you together. But the law of resonance is not personal, it's universal. It operates as naturally and impartially as any law of physics. Your evolution to a new frequency doesn't make you better than those operating at different wavelengths. It simply makes you different. A violin string tuned to one note isn't superior to a string tuned to another note. They simply create different sounds, serve different purposes in the larger symphony of existence. As your old relationships begin to feel discordant, you may notice new people appearing in your life with almost magical timing and appropriateness. These are souls who naturally resonate at your new frequency, who understand your evolved perspective without requiring extensive explanation, who share your commitment to consciousness and growth in ways that feel effortless and organic. These connections often have a quality of immediate recognition, as if you've been waiting to find each other across time and space. The timing of these new connections is rarely accidental. The universe seems to have an uncanny ability to bring together people who are operating at similar frequencies, creating opportunities for resonant relationships that support and amplify each person's continued evolution. You begin to understand that your frequency shift hasn't isolated you from connection, but has realigned you with the connections that can truly nourish your authentic being. This reshuffling extends beyond personal relationships to every area of your life. Career opportunities that align with your new frequency begin to appear, while old professional situations that no longer match your evolved consciousness become increasingly uncomfortable or untenable. Living situations that once felt perfect may suddenly feel constraining or inappropriate for who you're becoming. Even your physical environment, The places where you feel energized versus depleted, inspired versus drained, shifts to reflect your new vibrational signature. The frequency shift also affects your relationship with information and ideas. Books that once spoke to your soul may no longer hold the same magnetism, while authors and concepts you never encountered before suddenly seem to appear everywhere, offering exactly the insights your evolving consciousness is hungry to explore. Teachers who once inspired you may begin to feel limited or repetitive, while new guides emerge who can meet you at your current level of development and challenge you toward continued growth. Your creative expressions undergo similar transformation. The art you're drawn to create, the music that moves you, the forms of beauty that capture your attention, all of these shift to match your new frequency. You may find yourself abandoning creative pursuits that once felt essential while discovering new forms of expression that feel more aligned with your authentic nature. Your aesthetic preferences evolve to reflect your inner evolution, creating harmony between your internal and external environments. Even your physical health and vitality can be affected by this frequency shift. As you align more completely with your authentic nature, as you release the enormous energy expenditure required to maintain inauthentic patterns, as you begin living in greater harmony with your true self, you may discover reserves of energy you didn't know existed. The stress of constant self-suppression diminishes, the exhaustion of perpetual performance lifts, and you find yourself operating from a more sustainable and nourishing energetic foundation. The challenge of navigating this frequency shift lies in trusting the process, even when it feels disorienting or destabilizing. The natural human tendency is to cling to what's familiar, to resist changes that feel threatening to established patterns, to interpret the loss of old resonances as evidence that something has gone wrong. But the frequency shift is not a mistake, it's evolution in action. Consciousness reorganizing itself to support your continued growth and authentic expression. Learning to flow with this energetic reshuffling rather than resist it requires a particular kind of faith. Faith in the intelligence of your own evolution. Faith in the universe's ability to support your authentic development. Faith that what you're releasing was meant to be released and what you're attracting is meant to support your highest good. This faith isn't blind optimism but wise trust in the natural laws that govern consciousness and growth. The frequency shift also teaches profound lessons about attachment and non-attachment. You learn to hold relationships, opportunities and experiences more lightly, understanding that what serves your evolution at one stage may become inappropriate at another stage. You develop the capacity to love and appreciate what has been while remaining open to what might be, to honor your history while embracing your potential future. This doesn't mean becoming callous or indifferent to the people and experiences you're outgrowing. Rather, it means developing the wisdom to distinguish between authentic connection and attachment based on familiarity, between relationships that support mutual growth and relationships that require mutual stagnation, between love that honors evolution and love that demands limitation. The frequency shift reveals that love itself operates at different wavelengths. The love that once felt so important, love based on need, on shared wounds, on mutual projection, on familiar dysfunction, may no longer satisfy your evolved consciousness. You begin to hunger for love that operates at your new frequency, love based on recognition of authentic being, on mutual support for continued growth, on shared commitment to consciousness rather than shared attachment to limitation. As you become more comfortable with your new frequency, you also become more skilled at recognizing others' frequencies without judgment. You develop the ability to appreciate the beauty and validity of different wavelengths without needing to match them, to honor others' evolutionary timing without trying to accelerate or slow it, to maintain loving connection across frequency differences without trying to bridge gaps that aren't meant to be bridged. The frequency shift ultimately reveals that evolution is not a solo journey, but a collective symphony in which each individual consciousness contributes its unique note to the larger harmony of awakening. Your personal frequency shift serves not only your individual development, but the development of the whole, adding your evolved wavelength to the growing chorus of consciousness that is slowly but surely transforming the vibrational signature of human civilization itself. Your new frequency becomes a gift you offer to the world, a demonstration of possibilities that others might not have imagined, an invitation to growth that speaks to those ready to hear it, a beacon that helps other evolving souls recognize they are not alone in their journey toward authentic being. The law of resonance ensures that your evolved consciousness will attract and support others who are operating at similar frequencies while inspiring those at different wavelengths who are ready for their own frequency shift. The reshuffling of your external reality through this frequency shift is not chaos, but reorganization, not loss, but evolution, not ending, but beginning. You are not losing the life you once knew. You are growing into the life that truly matches who you've become. The universe is not taking things away from you. It's aligning you with experiences and connections that can genuinely support and celebrate your authentic being. Trust the frequency shift. Honor the natural law of resonance that is reshaping your world. Allow the old wavelength to fade without grief, and welcome the new frequencies with curiosity and openness. You are not becoming isolated. You are becoming aligned. You are not losing connection. You are finding the connections that match the truth of who you're becoming. Your evolved frequency is not a barrier to love, but a pathway to love that resonates at the deepest levels of authentic being. In the deepest chambers of transformation lies the ancient and inescapable truth that all authentic rebirth requires a death. All genuine phoenix rising demands the complete incineration of what came before. You have arrived at this sacred threshold, where the mythic becomes personal, where the archetypal narrative of death and resurrection ceases to be mere metaphor and reveals itself as the lived reality of your own evolutionary journey. Here, in this liminal space between who you were and who you are becoming, you must learn to grieve the relationships that cannot survive your metamorphosis, while simultaneously celebrating the authentic connections that are emerging from the ashes of your former life. This is perhaps the most bittersweet wisdom of conscious evolution. The recognition that not everything precious can be preserved through transformation, that some losses are not punishments but natural consequences of growth, that certain endings are not failures but completions. The phoenix does not mourn the caterpillar it once was. It honors that earlier form while embracing the magnificent winged creature it has become. Yet for human consciousness, with its deep capacity for love and attachment, this process of psychological death and rebirth carries emotional complexity that the mythic phoenix in its archetypal simplicity cannot fully capture. The relationships now burning away in the fire of your transformation were not mistakes, were not meaningless, were not merely obstacles to be overcome. They were the cocoon that protected your earlier development, the nutrients that fed your growing consciousness, the mirrors that showed you aspects of yourself you needed to see at particular stages of your journey. To honor them properly, you must resist the temptation to rewrite history, to diminish their importance in order to ease the pain of their ending, to create villains where there were only souls operating at different frequencies, evolving at different paces, committed to different levels of consciousness. The grief you feel as these relationships dissolve or transform beyond recognition is holy grief, sacred sorrow that honors the love that was real even if it could not accommodate the growth that became necessary. This grief is not evidence that something has gone wrong, but testimony to the depth of connection that was possible within the limitations that once bound you together. You are mourning not just the loss of specific people, but the death of entire ways of being, relating, and understanding yourself that must be released for your authentic self to fully emerge. Jung understood this phoenix process through his own experience of relationships that could not survive his psychological development. His break with Freud, though professionally necessary, carried personal grief for a mentorship that had been genuinely meaningful before it became limiting. His growing distance from colleagues who could not follow him into the territories he was exploring required mourning for shared understandings that were real but ultimately insufficient for his continued growth. Each loss was both ending and beginning, death and birth, tragedy and triumph. The ashes of your former relational life are not barren ground, but fertile soil from which new forms of connection can emerge. Every relationship that burns away in the fire of your transformation contributes something essential to the compost from which your future connections will grow. The lessons learned, the love experienced, the insights gained, the wounds healed. None of this is lost in the ending. It all becomes part of the rich foundation upon which more authentic relationships can be built. But this recognition, while ultimately comforting, does not diminish the immediate pain of watching relationships you cherished become casualties of your growth. The friend who cannot understand your commitment to consciousness and interprets it as rejection of your history together. The family member who experiences your boundary setting as abandonment and responds with guilt and manipulation. The romantic partner who fell in love with your wounds and cannot adapt to your healing. The colleague who enjoyed your shared cynicism and feels betrayed by your growing optimism and empowerment. Each of these losses carries its own particular anguish, because each represents not just the end of a relationship, but the death of a version of yourself that others loved and needed. You are not just losing them, you are killing the aspects of yourself that made these relationships possible. The people pleaser must die for authentic boundaries to emerge. The wounded healer must dissolve for genuine wholeness to arise. The familiar persona must incinerate for the true self to be born. This process of ego death within relationship is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of individuation, because it occurs in the social realm where the ego feels most attached to its familiar roles and identities. It's one thing to release outdated beliefs in the privacy of your own contemplation. It's another to watch cherished relationships die, because you can no longer play the parts that those relationships required you to play. The phoenix phase of transformation demands that you develop what might be called sacred ruthlessness, the willingness to let relationships die when keeping them alive would require the murder of your own authenticity. This is not callousness but compassion for the truth of what is actually happening. Attempting to preserve relationships that can only survive your limitation is not loving but enabling, not kindness but collusion with unconsciousness, not preservation of connection but prolonging of death. Yet even as you allow certain relationships to burn away in the fire of your transformation, you begin to notice green shoots of new connection emerging from the ashes. These new relationships often have a quality that was missing from your former connections. They are based not on who you were but on who you are becoming. Not on your limitations but on your potential. Not on your wounds but on your healing. Not on your unconscious patterns but on your growing awareness. The people who enter your life during or after your phoenix phase often feel like gifts from the universe. Souls who recognize and celebrate your authentic being rather than mourning your transformed persona. They meet you at your new level of consciousness without requiring explanation or justification for your growth. They offer the relief of being seen and appreciated for who you truly are, rather than who others need you to be. These new connections often have an ease and naturalness that makes you realize how much effort your previous relationships required. You no longer need to translate your insights into acceptable language, dim your light to avoid disturbing others' comfort zones, or suppress your authentic expression to maintain artificial harmony. The energy that was once consumed by the constant work of managing others' reactions to your growth becomes available for the joy of sharing your authentic self with those who can appreciate it. But the emergence of new relationships does not automatically heal the grief of lost ones. The phoenix does not forget its ashes. It carries the memory of its former form into its new existence. Part of honoring the death and rebirth process involves learning to hold space for both gratitude for what was and excitement for what is becoming, both sorrow for what cannot continue and joy for what is emerging. This dual awareness, the capacity to mourn endings while celebrating beginnings, represents a crucial stage in psychological maturation. It requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in creative tension rather than collapsing into either pure grief or pure excitement. You learn to be simultaneously the one who grieves and the one who celebrates, the one who remembers what was lost, and the one who welcomes what is being found. The Phoenix phase also teaches profound lessons about the nature of love itself. You begin to understand that true love supports transformation rather than resisting it, celebrates growth rather than fearing it, honors becoming rather than clinging to being. The relationships that survive your Phoenix process are those that possessed this quality of transformational love from the beginning, connections that were built not on mutual need or shared limitation, but on mutual recognition of each other's essential nature and commitment to supporting each other's authentic development. Some relationships, remarkably, undergo their own Phoenix process in response to your transformation. Partners, friends, or family members who initially resist your growth may eventually be inspired by your example to undertake their own journeys of conscious evolution. The very changes that initially threaten the relationship become catalysts for deeper, more authentic connection. These relationships don't just survive your transformation, they are reborn through it, emerging stronger, more genuine, and more capable of supporting continued growth. But not all relationships possess this regenerative capacity, and learning to accept this without judgment becomes essential for your own continued evolution. Some connections were meant to serve specific phases of your development and naturally complete when those phases end. Some people are traveling different paths at different speeds and cannot accompany you into the territories you're exploring. Some souls are committed to remaining at consciousness levels that you've graduated from, and honoring their choice while honoring your own growth requires a kind of loving detachment that can only be learned through experience. The ashes of your former relational life also reveal patterns that were invisible while you were living within them. You begin to see how certain relationships were based on mutual projection, shared wounds, or unconscious agreements to enable each other's limitations. You recognize dynamics of codependency, people-pleasing, or emotional fusion that felt like love but actually prevented authentic intimacy. You understand how your own unhealed patterns attracted people who reflected those patterns back to you, creating cycles of familiar dysfunction disguised as deep connection. This recognition brings both humility and empowerment. Humility because you see your own role in creating and maintaining relationships that ultimately served limitation rather than growth. Empowerment because you understand that changing your internal patterns naturally shifts the types of relationships you attract and maintain. The phoenix that rises from the ashes carries the wisdom gained from the burning, ensuring that future connections will be built on more conscious foundations. The grief process itself becomes a form of purification, burning away not just the relationships that cannot survive your growth, but also the attachment patterns, emotional dependencies, and unconscious needs that made those relationships feel necessary rather than chosen. You learn to love without possessing, to connect without controlling, to care without codependency. The fire that consumes your old relationships also burns away the parts of yourself that could only love from neediness rather than fullness. As you move through this phoenix phase, you may find yourself experiencing periods of profound loneliness, interspersed with moments of incredible liberation. The loneliness is real and should be honored. You are grieving not just specific relationships, but an entire way of being in relationship, mourning the familiar forms of connection that once provided meaning and identity. But the liberation is equally real. You are free from the exhausting work of maintaining connections that required your inauthenticity, released from the burden of managing others' comfort with your growth. The Phoenix phase ultimately reveals that authentic relationship requires two complete individuals choosing connection rather than two incomplete people needing each other to feel whole. The relationships that emerge from your ashes are characterized by this quality of chosen rather than needed love, conscious rather than unconscious connection, celebration rather than toleration of each other's authentic nature. In time, as you integrate the lessons of the Phoenix phase, you develop what might be called regenerative love, the capacity to love in ways that support transformation rather than preventing it, to hold space for others' growth, even when it inconveniences you, to offer the gift of your authentic presence, rather than demanding conformity to your emotional needs. You become capable of loving others through their own Phoenix phases, providing stable witness to their death and rebirth processes, rather than trying to preserve versions of them that they are meant to outgrow. The Phoenix and the ashes are not separate phenomena, but aspects of a single process of conscious evolution. The death enables the birth, the burning clears the ground for new growth, the ending creates space for a more magnificent beginning. What feels like destruction is actually creation. What appears as loss is actually transformation. What seems like ending is actually commencement of something more beautiful than what came before. Trust the fire, honor the ashes, celebrate the wings that are emerging from the flames of your former life. You are not losing your capacity for connection. You are evolving into someone capable of connections more authentic, more conscious, more genuinely loving than anything you've known before. The phoenix rising from the ashes of your transformed relationships carries within its renewed being the seeds of love that will flourish in the fertile ground of your continued becoming. Needs that made those relationships feel necessary rather than chosen. You learn to love without possessing, to connect without controlling, to care without codependency. The fire that consumes your old relationships also burns away the parts of yourself that could only love from neediness rather than fullness. As you move through this phoenix phase, you may find yourself experiencing periods of profound loneliness, interspersed with moments of incredible liberation. The loneliness is real and should be honored. You are grieving not just specific relationships, but an entire way of being in relationship, mourning the familiar forms of connection that once provided meaning and identity. But the liberation is equally real. You are free from the exhausting work of maintaining connections that required your inauthenticity, released from the burden of managing others' comfort with your growth. The Phoenix phase ultimately reveals that authentic relationship requires two complete individuals choosing connection rather than two incomplete people needing each other to feel whole. The relationships that emerge from your ashes are characterized by this quality of chosen rather than needed love, conscious rather than unconscious connection, celebration rather than toleration of each other's authentic nature. In time, as you integrate the lessons of the Phoenix phase, you develop what might be called regenerative love, the capacity to love in ways that support transformation rather than preventing it, to hold space for others' growth, even when it inconveniences you, to offer the gift of your authentic presence, rather than demanding conformity to your emotional needs. You become capable of loving others through their own phoenix phases, providing stable witness to their death and rebirth processes, rather than trying to preserve versions of them that they are meant to outgrow. The phoenix and the ashes are not separate phenomena, but aspects of a single process of conscious evolution. The death enables the birth, the burning clears the ground for new growth, the ending creates space for a more magnificent beginning. What feels like destruction is actually creation. What appears as loss is actually transformation. What seems like ending is actually commencement of something more beautiful than what came before. Trust the fire, honor the ashes, celebrate the wings that are emerging from the flames of your former life. You are not losing your capacity for connection. You are evolving into someone capable of connections more authentic, more conscious, more genuinely loving than anything you've known before. The phoenix rising from the ashes of your transformed relationships carries within its renewed being the seeds of love that will flourish in the fertile ground of your continued becoming.